Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Ross. I am a GRC consultant for IT governance. And this afternoon on the webinar, we're going to talk about two pieces of legislation, the General Data Protection Regulation and something called the NIS Directive. And we're going to look at risk-based security measures and notification requirements for both of those pieces of legislation. GDPR, for those of you who don't know, is the first major piece of European legislation in 22 years relating to data protection. And the NIS Directive is the first comprehensive piece of EU legislation relating to the 2013 EU Cybersecurity Strategy. So we're going to look at both of these pieces of legislation, and to some degree they overlap with one another, but hopefully I'm going to be able to compare and contrast both pieces of legislation as we move through the webinar today. Okay, so a little bit about me. My background there, as you can see, is as a GRC consultant, and over the period of my career has involved things like infrastructure services, business process reengineering, and more recently in the last 10 years or so, intellectual property, legal compliance, and I work for the data protection team at IT governance, and more so recently looking at things from a risk perspective, and I very much advocate enterprise risk management. So that's a little bit about me, and then we'll talk about IT governance. Now, IT governance is a one-stop shop for governance, risk and compliance, and I work in that top area there, governance, risk and compliance. As you can see, we have a number of elements to the business. On the one side, we have a very strong cyber security capability, covering all these different elements, including business continuity, information security 27001, PCI DSS, penetration testing. And then on the other side, my colleagues have a great depth of experience in service management, things like ITIL and COBIT, Prince2, and then across the bottom there layer you can see we do lots of consultancy and certification around information security to the various standards 27001, 27017, 18. We do security testing. We run a number of training courses constantly across Europe, and do all kinds of things like, as we say, we now have this GDPR foundation and practitioner qualifications that are increasingly popular and throughout the European Union. We have a number of software tools, principally one called VS Risk, which integrates with the international standards like ISO 27001 and more recently GDPR. And then we have a set of toolkits and publications. On our toolkit side, we have implementation toolkits for the GDPR, which we're now working on, just about to release our second phase GDPR toolkit. We have our ISO 27001 toolkit and various other toolkits in there. And we produce lots of publications. So I think we distribute the written publications and ebooks certainly across the world now. As an organisation, we work in all vertical sectors, and in fact we have some of the largest organisations in the world as customers. I myself tend to specialise in sort of banking, the more regulated sectors of Europe, and as I say, we have all organisation sizes from very small startups to cloud providers, more traditional other organisations. Okay, so in terms of this afternoon's agenda, what we thought we would look at is firstly give an overview of the regulatory landscape. We have two pieces of legislation here, and they work in slightly different ways, but important ways too. Then we'll look at the subject matter, what's in scope, both materially and territorially. Look at remedies, liabilities and penalties that are going to be applied. Look at personal data breaches under the General Data Protection, and then we'll move on to talk about the NIS Directive, talk a bit about operators of essential services, digital service providers, and then sort of compare and contrast the two different pieces of legislation and see how they come at things from a different perspective. What they have in common is that both pieces of legislation are looking to protect personally identifiable or personal data. One, the GDPR is looking at within traditional organisations with whatever boundaries they may have, whereas NIS is looking to protect the data in the infrastructure that is out there, and we can talk a little bit about that once we get to those pieces of legislation. Okay, so this is an important slide in that we have two types of legal instrument here in effect. We have directives. Now, directives come out of the European Union, and they are a broad set of principles, and it leaves it to each member state to determine what they call the form and methods. So it is, as I say, a set of principles that says we have to achieve this. How each country in the European Union go about it is pretty much up to each member state, but directives require each individual member state to implement their own legislation. As you can see by that second bullet point on the slide there, implemented by the creation of national laws approved by the national parliaments. A good example of that would be we had the Data Protection Directive in 1995. As a consequence of that, we implemented the Data Protection Act in the United Kingdom in 1998. Okay, but more relevant to today, we're talking about the Directive on Security of Network and Information Systems. This is the one that the seminar is about, or webinar is about, and of course, now that I've explained directives, what we need to do then is consider what national laws each member state has to implement in response to this directive. On the other side of the slide, we have regulations, and regulations are what we call, they have immediate applicability in each member state, so there's no requirement for each of the countries in the European Union to implement their own versions of local laws. And as we can see there, the GDPR is a regulation with its number there. Now, the effect of both of these methods, if you like, is that under directives where each member state has to implement its own national laws, this of course leaves it open to different interpretations of what the directive means, and then within each country what we've ended up with, particularly when we think about data protection law, is we've ended up with effectively 28 different data protection implementations across Europe. If we can contrast that with regulation, the theory with the regulation is that we have better harmonization across the European Union. We have one law that is applied in all member states, but I will go into that a bit more detail as we move through the presentation today. Okay, so let's talk about the General Data Protection Regulation to begin with. Okay, so there are some dates there, and we're pretty much along the way on this calendar, if you like. The next important date is the 25th of May 2018. So the regulation entered force on 24th of May 2016, and it goes through a process, being adopted by the European Parliament, then it gets published in the official journal in all the languages. It goes into force, and then it becomes applicable 2 years after that. So the GDPR comes into effect 25th of May next year. So organisations now are increasingly working towards becoming compliant or being compliant by that date. Okay, so who and where does this regulation apply? Well, it applies to something called natural persons. Natural persons, quite simply, are living individuals, and living individuals have rights associated with, firstly, the protection of their personal data, protection related to processing of personal data, and something called the unrestricted movement of personal data within the European Union. Those of us who've been around the European Union for a while are familiar with the term the unrestricted movement of people. Well, this is the similar concept in the GDPR, where the EU is looking to have unrestricted movement of personal data throughout the European Union. If we think about what's in the material scope, well, it's personal data that's processed wholly or partly by automated means, and automated means by a computer. So that covers all kinds of network activities, anything like that. And it's personal data that's forms part of a filing system. Now, what that line is intended to mean is that paper-based records are included in this regulation. So if we have a set of personal or paper-based records that are indexed in such a fashion where we can go to and identify a natural person or a living individual, that is within the scope of this regulation. If we have a set of paper-based records that are not indexed in such a fashion that we can identify a living individual, that is not within the scope of this regulation. And the regulation applies to controllers and processors in the EU, irrespective of where processing takes place. Yeah. Okay, but also, and finally that line at the bottom, it applies to controllers who are not in the EU. So if the controller is not in the EU but processing data about people in the EU, they are within the scope of this regulation. Okay, now natural persons, that's people like all of us on the webinar today. We have rights, and we have a number of rights under the GDPR, and we have a right to judicial remedy where our rights have been infringed as a result of processing. Now, this is a long-worded sentence there, but think if we have a data breach, our data is breached, we have judicial rights. And we can raise a claim in the courts of the member states where the controller or processor has an establishment. Establishment is a is a legal term, but if we think most normally, it is where the controller or processor have an office, or if it's a processor, it could be the data center, but it's where they have some form of footprint, if you like. And once you get down into the detail of the regulation, it talks about, for a controller, for instance, the first test would be where the purpose and means are being determined. So whatever country that is being done in, that's where we'd raise a claim against the controller. Processor might be where they have the data center. But establishment can take a number of different forms. It can be head office, it can be factory, it can be data center, and in fact some particular offerings on the internet these days have tried to argue that they don't have an establishment, and the courts have decided, well, wherever that service or that profiling or monitoring is being done is where the establishment is. And we can also raise a claim in the courts of the member state where the data subject habitually resides. Okay, so there's a number of places that we can raise claims. In fact, we can raise a claim where the data subject resides, we can raise a claim where they work, or we can raise a claim where the infringement takes place. So there's a number of different areas that we can raise claims, but natural persons have rights. Okay, now that next one, any person who has suffered material or non-material damage has a right to receive compensation. And note that is from both the controller or processor, because under this regulation, the processor is now in scope, and that brings in some fairly sizable organizations throughout the world. Material scope, well, historically within data protection, it's always difficult to try and work out what the material damage is. But the courts, certainly in the United Kingdom more recently, have started to award claims for non-material damage. And non-material damage is things like damage to reputations, hurt feelings, embarrassment, trauma, anything under that particular heading. And in fact, in this particular bit of the regulation, it's not restricted to the data subject, who the data is about. It could be another family member. So for instance, I might have some sensitive information about me that when it's breached, I'm not particularly upset about it, but if it causes embarrassment or trauma or anything like that for a member of my family, they themselves can raise a claim under this regulation. Okay, so controllers, as you can see, they're involved in processing, shall be liable for damage caused by processing. So one of the challenges in the market is very difficult sometimes for organizations to work out whether they're a controller or a processor, and in fact you can have a hybrid between the two, and this is what this particular line of the legislation is talking about, where we have an organization, a person or an organization that is a controller and is doing processing also. Yeah, they will be liable for damage that is caused by processing as well as being a controller. Now we have this new thing under the general data protection regulation, something that we didn't have under the Data Protection Directive 22 years ago, and it's administrative fines. Okay, so we have this term that we talk about. Each fine will have to be effective, proportionate and dissuasive, and what that means is that people are intended to take these fines seriously. Yeah, and the courts or the supervisory authority, the regulators, will seek to try and apply some consistency across the European Union, whilst they will also take into account what technical and organisational measures organisations have implemented to protect rights of the data subject. Yeah? So that will be things like policies and procedures, what standards they've adopted, what sectoral codes of conduct they've adopted, all those kind of things to get a measure of how they've attempted to conform with the regulation. Okay, now the fines have two tiers. They are up to 10 million euros or 2% of the total worldwide annual turnover, or 20 million, 4% of total worldwide annual turnover in the preceding financial year. Now, that's quite an important bit to grasp here, because the fine is up to 4% of total worldwide annual turnover. So it's not profit, it's turnover in the preceding financial year. Now, that will generally be a published figure. If it's a UK listed company, it will be in the annual report, or if it's not a UK listed company, that information will be filed at Companies House. Now, I myself have a particular client at the moment who turns over billions of pounds, but at a very small margin, and we sat down the other day and worked out that 4% of their turnover would be about 3 years' profits. So fairly sizable fines now. Organisations starting to take this very seriously. Okay, so if we start to look at certainly data breaches in the United Kingdom, and this is 2016 data from the UK Information Commissioner, we can see that on that quarter there was 448 cases of data breaches. You can see by far the health sector stands head and shoulders above every other sector in the UK, and that's possibly down to the fact that in the health sector we have mandatory data breach reporting in the United Kingdom. And also, health sector deals with lots of sensitive data, as you would expect, lots of patient data, followed by local government. Well, local government again is another sector of the UK economy that deals with lots of sensitive data. They have data relating to homeless people, data relating to children in care, all that kind of stuff. And then we've got education. Well, even in education, you know, schools hold data about children, about their grades, about disciplinary matters. And there's, as you can see, each one of these professions holds different levels of data and have breached in different ways. Okay, so when we look at cyber breaches, as you can see there, the percentage of organisations experiencing cyber breach or attacks within the last 12 months, yeah, overall 27% or 24% there. And as you can see, the figures change as you go along the different sizes of organisations there. Yeah, so average number of breaches, as you can see, for small organisations compared to medium, compared to large, and in fact the sort of financial scale of all of this varies between large and small organisations too. So in a large organisation, average is about 50,000 to the highest being about 3 million. And we would say that this problem is getting worse every day, because 12 months ago you heard about a breach every other day. Now we're hearing about 3 or 4 breaches per day. So the scale is increasing all the time. Okay, now the key point to get off this particular slide is most of the breaches are down to things like viruses, spyware or malware by far. Those are the highest causes of breaches. So we'll just move on from this particular slide, but you can see they're all broken down there by Ipsos Mori in their cybersecurity survey, but by far and away are viruses, spyware and malware. Okay, so Article 32 of the GDPR, there is a requirement, or this particular article relates to security of processing, and there is a requirement for controllers and data processors. It applies to both organizations to implement a level of security appropriate to the risk. Now you say, well, what does that actually mean? Well, if you're an organization that is purely processing personal information, that is one risk level, if you like. If you're an organization that is processing highly sensitive information, that is another level of risk. And you are expected, controllers and processors are expected to implement the appropriate level of security in the organization. Well, there are a number of techniques that we can use to do that, pseudonymization, encryption being 2 of them there. And this second line, ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity and availability of systems. Well, those 3 words, for anybody who's worked in the information security sector, that talks about ISO 27001 as being the appropriate standard. We recognize those words immediately. And in fact, there is a strong element in the GDPR that says that organizations, that's controllers and processors, should be adopting appropriate industry standards. And what we find at IT governance, particularly when we run our courses, and our GDPR practitioner course in particular, is people start the week thinking, I don't have to implement ISO 27001 to be GDPR compliant, and by the end of the week the attitude is I don't see how I can be compliant with GDPR without implementing ISO 27001. So within the regulation, it expects organisations to be adopting the appropriate standards and mechanisms that are out there to ensure that information is being protected. Okay, so moving on to that next point, policies are one thing, but also we must measure, test, assess and evaluate the effectiveness of security measures. Well, again, anybody that's been involved in information security this won't be anything new to them, but clearly that it's one thing implementing policies, procedures, we must also measure, assess and evaluate. Okay, and then security measures need to comply with the concept of privacy by design. This is not a new thing to the regulation. Privacy by design has been around for a number of years, but it's reinforced in this regulation, and reinforced in a way that aligns with the higher level of fines. Yeah. Now, typically when we talk to organisations about privacy by design, we're talking to sort of software development people or program management people, and talking about risks to data subjects being considered at the very first stage of a project. And where we do see where it's being done at the moment, it tends to be the last thing that is in the project plan. We planned everything else in the project, and then at the moment organisations say, oh, we must consider data privacy. Well, what this is saying in the regulation is data privacy should be number one consideration in any project, and it should be designed into systems and architectures and procedures, policies and everything we do throughout the organisation. It should permeate throughout the organisation. Okay, so what is a personal data breach? Well, there's quite a broad definition there, but consider it to be anything that leads to accidental, unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, any of those words there. So that's quite a wide definition, and we have some very wide definitions in the GDPR, processing being another one, very wide definition, and processing could incorporate even just storing information. Okay. So we have obligations relating to personal data. Now there's obligations on controllers and there's obligation on processors. So in relation to data breaches, at the processor level, they have to notify the controller without delay. Okay, there's no exemptions to this, so the processor has to notify the controller in every case where there is a breach. There are no exemptions to that, and as it says there, all data breaches have to be reported. Okay, now there is this term, that first bullet point there should actually say without undue delay, and the European Data Protection Board is going to issue guidance as one of a long list of things they have to issue guidance about, and issue guidance clarification with regard to what does undue delay actually mean for the processor there. On the controller side, controllers have to notify the supervisory authority no later than 72 hours, and there is a caveat with that, and the caveat is sometimes, or it's unnecessary in certain circumstances. They have to, when carrying out the notification, they have to describe the nature of the breach, and there is guidance within the regulation about all the different things that need to be included. So it will be the nature of the breach, what kind of data is it? Is it sensitive or is it just personal data? How many records? What categories of data subjects? Is it children? Is it or more broadly, is it more natural persons? And there's no requirement to notify if there's no risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. And you may well say, well, what does that mean? There has since the regulation came out in 2016, there is now some guidance starting to come out, but when we talk about risks to rights and freedoms of natural persons, we're talking about sensitive data. Yeah. Failure for the controller to notify within that 72-hour period will require an explanation. Okay, what is it about what the controller was doing that hindered them conforming to the 72-hour window? Okay, so 72-hour window, notification to supervisory authority sometimes, depending on what the data is. Okay, so there may well be in fact, an obligation on the data controller to communicate the personal data breach to data subjects. If you think about it, there are kind of several actors in this play, if you like. There are controllers, there's processors, there's data subjects, and there are, so the breach may become news by a number of different sources. The controller might discover the breach, the processor, the data subject, or in fact a third party might discover the breach. And there are obligations in certain circumstances for the controller to communicate the breach to the data subject, and they have to do that when there is if there's a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individual. So if it's sensitive data, they have to communicate to the data subject. The communication has to be in clear, plain language. The controller themselves may elect to say, based on their decision-making criteria, that it's not sensitive information and it doesn't, it's not at risk to the data subjects. The supervisor can overrule the controller in those circumstances and order them to communicate with the data subjects. Okay, there are certain exemptions to that. So if, for instance, the data is breached, but because of technical and organizational measures such as encryption or pseudonymization, it's not, you cannot identify the individual, so the data has been breached, but you can't identify the individual, there is an exemption to that obligation to notify the data subject. If the risk the data subject will not materialize, or if the communication with data subject would involve disproportionate effort. Now, what that's targeted at is if, as a controller, you may have, for instance, I think it's one of the trade unions in the United Kingdom has over 2 million members. You're not expected to phone every single one of them, but there is also a provision in the regulation to allow you to make a communication in a form that will notify all of them at once. So press release or something on the website would be appropriate. So there is that within the regulation too. Okay, there's also an obligation within the regulation for each member state to create independent supervisory authorities. They must have at least one, and to resource them appropriately. Now, what that means is just to fund them, to give them the appropriate level of funding, but also these supervisory authorities, their task is to monitor and enforce the regulation across the European Union, to communicate with one another and promote awareness, and they will have powers, a number of powers, to investigate, correct, advise, enforce, and we have something called a lead supervisory authority, and very simply where the lead supervisory authority occurs is where we have a controller that is operating in a number of countries. If, for instance, there is a breach of data subjects' data, well, if we were operating in France, Italy, and Germany, only one of those countries should lead the investigation, and that's what the lead supervisory authority does. It leads investigations where there are cross-border processing. Okay, so what we say with this slide is you cannot be GDPR compliant unless you're adopting cybersecurity as well. Okay, that falls within the requirement within the regulation to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. So if you think about breaches can come from a number of different areas. They can come from inside the organization out, but also we've seen earlier on some of the cybersecurity slides, they can come from external into the organization. Yeah. Now, organizations must include appropriate data protection policies. As I mentioned earlier, adherence to approved codes of conduct or management system certifications. ICO and BSI are both developing GDPR-focused standards. ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office. Well, they publish guidance on various different things like consent, data protection impact assessments, the latest one that have come out. ISO 27001 already meets the appropriate technical and organizational measures. There is a new standard just been released recently in the United Kingdom, the British standard 10,012. And I would suggest to you that if you print that standard off and have a look, you'll see it's specifically focused on general data protection regulations. And these provide assurance to the board, because remember that these fines, 4% of global turnover, that should be something that the board is very focused on and ensuring that it's being managed in accordance with the regulation. Yep, so we're looking to manage all information assets and information security and protecting against all threats. Okay, so let's talk now about the NIS Directive. Okay, now this, as I said earlier, was in relation to the first comprehensive piece of EU legislation relating to the 2013 EU cyber strategy. So this is why we have NIS, because of this 2013 EU cyber strategy. So there are the key dates there. You'll notice there it goes live on the 10th of May 2018. Now if we just reflect back for a moment, this is a directive. So member states have a bit of work to do to become compliant themselves, because they may well have to implement their own laws within each country to align themselves with this directive. Remember, the last directive we had from Europe relating to data protection was in 1995. We have to implement the Data Protection Act 1998, so we have to go down this route with this particular piece of legislation. Okay, so as I've said there, first piece of comprehensive EU legislation relating to the 2013 cyber security strategy. And what we're trying to achieve with this particular piece of legislation is a high common level of security of network and information systems right across the European Union. Yeah, so we're approaching this from a cyber security perspective. So at each national level, there has to be an increased EU level of cooperation, and we'll come on to that in a bit. And it makes reference within this directive to the 95 Data Protection Directive. So the Data Protection Directive that came out in 95, we then looked at that from a privacy perspective and implemented the Data Protection Act 1998. Well, this references back to that directive because it's the only thing it can link to. Okay. So when we look at the subject matter and scope within this particular directive, okay, we're looking to improve the functioning of the internal market. Yeah. Now there's obligation on each member state to adopt a national strategy for the security of network and information systems. Now in the United Kingdom, the two entities have been allocated for this task, and they are the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre, and it was set up to protect central services or critical services from cyber attacks, yeah, and manage major incidents and improve underlying security. So that's one of the entities in the UK, the other one being the CPNI, Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure, and they are the Centre for Protective Security Advice to UK National Infrastructure, and they report directly into the Director General of MI5. So when we think about NIS, we're thinking about critical national infrastructure. Yeah. Creation of cooperation groups. Well, this is something within the NIS Directive, and cooperation groups will comprise a number of different elements. There will be representatives from each of the member states, there'll be representatives from the Commission, and there'll be an organisation called ENISA, that's E-N-I-S-A, and that's the European Union Agency for Network Information Security. So that will be the cooperation group that will operate across Europe. In addition to that, we will have computer security incident response teams, so CSIRTs there, and they will be sort of in the front line, and their job is to provide early threat warnings, respond to incidents, and cooperate with organisations in the private sector. So we've got a number of different teams, if you like, operating across the European Union, and we have to establish security notification requirements for operators, two types of organisations, operators of essential services and digital service providers. Okay, so finally on that slide, each member state has a legal obligation to establish national competent authorities. Now, as I gave you the two for the UK earlier, there will be different ones in different countries, and there'll be single points of contact for CSIRTs and anything to do with tasks related to security of networks and information systems. Okay, so as I said, it applies to two types of organisations, operators of essential services, and these are operators of critical infrastructures, and there's the industry sectors. It's defined in the directive in Annex 2, I think it is, and it's industry sectors, energy, transport, banking, financial markets, health, water, all these organisations, as I said, yeah, it does say they're set out in Annex 2. A good example of an organisation in that particular infrastructure would be the London Stock Exchange. That would fall within the definition of critical infrastructures or industry sectors. Then we have digital service providers, and those are For instance, any legal person, so any organisation that provides a digital service, such as online marketing, marketplaces, search engines, cloud computing, app stores, it doesn't apply to micro or small enterprises. So, yeah, so we should be quite clear about those. And it doesn't apply to all operators of essential services or DSPs, digital service providers. Certain sectors are exempt, if you like, because they're already sufficiently regulated or are planned to be before this directive goes live. Okay, and in that particular scenario, then this directive has no application. Some sectors within the United Kingdom, for instance, are heavily regulated and have sufficient adequacy built in place. But there is an expectation that each sector must provide the equivalent level of protection. Okay, so each country designates which essential services are within the scope. So the member states have got to do that by 9th of November 2018. Okay, and the set criteria for the identifier, so there's some guidance in the directive itself. And it includes things like incidents that would have significant disruptive effects on provision. Yep. And this list of operators of essential services is revised every 2 years. It gets submitted back to the cooperation group, and they revise what is going on within each of the member states. Okay, so it applies to all digital service providers, and member state rules apply to establishment of DSPs. Well, what that's about is that there are certain rules and criteria that has been established some time ago in European law in relation to what constitutes establishment. Remember I said earlier that establishment just could be head office, or it could be the data centre. It's where you've got a significant presence, either by the controller making its decisions on the purpose and means, or the volume of data that's being processed. So there are a number of guidance elements there, and there is a hierarchy to the establishment, but wherever there is a presence, if you like. Okay, so recital 65, the directive applies to digital DSPs outside the EU that offer services within the EU. Now, there is some history within the European Union where organisations have said, well, we don't actually offer anything in the European Union, and one of the tests is where you can look at the language or currency that is being used. If it's being used, for instance, in more than one member state, they're offering people the opportunity to buy in Deutschmarks and francs and euros and sterling. Well, that constitutes an offering within the European Union. Okay, where the DSP is outside the EU and they're offering services in the EU, the representative, they have to appoint a representative to act on their behalf, and this is particularly in relation to incident reporting, and this very closely maps onto how the GDPR is intended to work. It's exactly the same way where you have control of the process outside the EU, they have to have a representative inside the EU, and that representative will be the contact point for the authorities, cooperation groups and CSIRPs, as we discussed earlier. So operators of essential services, as is the case with the GDPR, must take appropriate technical and organisational measures, very similar to the way the GDPR works, but they are managing the security of network and information systems. They must take steps to prevent and minimise the impact of incidents with a view to ensuring continuity of services. They're very strong on that within the directive. Notify the competent authority, and those are yet to be established in some of the member states without undue delay, and remember we had undue delay within the GDPR as well. Okay, and some of the things that they must consider when looking at the impact of an incident is number of users affected, duration of the incident, geographical spread. Well, this is all in line with the way that the GDPR works. Okay, now DSPs must take appropriate technical and organisational measures similar to controllers or essential providers of essential services rather, and these things must include security of systems, incident handling, business continuity, monitoring, auditing, testing, compliance with international standards. Well, we already talked about ISO 27001 as being an appropriate information security standard. Okay, now the Commission, what's interesting about this directive is the Commission can determine further elements but the member states cannot impose any further security or notification requirements on the DSPs. Yeah. And then again, DSPs must take steps to prevent and minimize the impact of the incidents. Okay, and it's all about ensuring continuity. Okay, so DSPs must ensure they notify the competent authority or CSIRTs without undue delay, and we saw those words earlier on in the GDPR, of any impact or incident having a substantial impact on the provision of services. Okay, and when we determine whether the impact of an incident is substantial, these are the things that we need to consider: number of users, the duration of the incident, the geographical spread, the extent of the disruption of the functioning of the service, or the extent of impact on economic or societal activities. Okay, so for the NIS Directive, we're coming to the end of the webinar now. The intention is to have a high level of harmonisation across the member states. However, there will be variation between each member state through the method of adoption. Remember I said earlier that a directive leaves each member state to determine the form and methods. And also, in addition to that, there are laws in each of the member states. So in France, for instance, many of the requirements of the NIS Directive set out in the Military Planning Act. Germany, we have the IT Security Act that covers many of the requirements of the NIS Directive. Contrast that with places like the UK and the Netherlands, where we don't have detailed cybersecurity laws. And also there is many different sector-based competent authorities. So UK, we have the FCA for financial services. Yeah. So the implementation will be, if you like, a combination of new laws and amendments to existing laws, which we would say is actually contrary to harmonisation. If it had been a regulation, you would achieve harmonisation much easier. So, but also when we look at the GDPR, it is designed to harmonise across the data protection across the member states. However, there are over 40 derogations, that is exceptions within the GDPR, that allow a variation of the GDPR between the member states, and that can be things like age of a child, which can vary between 13 and 16 across the European Union. And if you're a controller or a processor who's providing services to children, you have to be aware of the variances in each of the member states. So the question is, how much harmonisation we're having? Well, we're going to have a lot more than we had under the directive, or the previous directive, but we're not going to have 100%. The GDPR has a mandatory appointment of data protection officers in certain circumstances, typically where there are public bodies or there's large-scale processing of information or monitoring and profiling of EU citizens. There's mandatory breach reporting in certain circumstances. There's something called prior consultation, where, for instance, if we're going live with a new project or a new infrastructure or a new type of service, we have to undergo prior consultation with the relevant supervisory authority prior to going live and establish what the risks are. Data processors are now brought into scope with the GDPR, and that brings in some fairly sizable organisations. Controllers have to demonstrate accountability, and accountability is how they are measured with regard to the application of the data protection principles, but it goes wider than that. And also we have this thing with the GDPR now, we have the introduction of administrative fines. Okay, and those are fairly sizable. So just wrapping up now before we take some questions. IT governance, we have a number of self-help materials. We have pocket guides, implementation manuals. As I said earlier, we have a documentation toolkit, which we're now looking at to release shortly, phase 2 of the GDPR toolkit. We have gap assessment tools within the organisation, so we have those up on the website that people can get access to. And we have a number of training courses that are available. Okay, typically we have a one-day accredited foundation course. That's quite an intensive one-day course, and as I say, it is an accredited course, and we've put through quite a number of people on that course now. What follows on the back of that is a 4-day practitioner course, and that course revolves around a case study that we follow over the period of 4 days and looks in depth at some of the issues that we need to get our heads around with regard to GDPR. And then we've just released a 1-day data protection impact assessment course. Data protection impact assessment is also something that's in the GDPR, and I often describe it as being a super risk assessment of the risks related to whatever it is we're going live with, whatever piece of infrastructure or systems or processes. Okay, so I'm now going to open up the forum for any questions that anybody may have. Just before I do that, just remembered my colleagues in the marketing department are going to be sending out a copy of the slides. I think they do it in PDF format, so those will probably come out today or first thing tomorrow morning. And then we can take questions also going forward. So I'm just going to open up the line for questions now. So any questions by anyone? Okay, here we go, coming in thick and fast. Let me just go back to the top, see what they are. First question, I already have the GDPR toolkit. Will it be possible to upgrade to the new version? Yes, I believe so. I'm not sure, I don't think there is a cost, but don't quote me on that. I'm not on the commercial side of the organisation, but I know there is an upgrade path there, definitely. Okay. Somebody's asking a question, what happens if we leave the European Union? Well, that's quite a good question actually, because we're already on our way to leaving the European Union. The Information Commissioner, also the Supervisory Authority or the Data Protection Authority, whatever you want to call them, has already indicated, and it's been backed up by the UK government, that we will be adopting the GDPR and probably rolling it into our domestic law. And I guess, given that we will have to comply with the European Union directive, the NIS directive, we will be rolling that into domestic law as well. So there are, now what we won't have, of course, is under the GDPR there is something called the European Data Protection Board that is currently made up of a representative of each of the 28 member states. Now when we are not a member state, we won't have representation on that particular board, so we will lose representation. Yeah. Okay. Somebody saying, asking if data held within a database, for instance SQL, is classed as encrypted. Well, I'm not a technical person, but what I would do is turn that around and say that when you're looking at that record, can you identify a data subject or a natural person? Those are both the same things. One of the challenges with GDPR in particular is that we interchange terms. So we talk about natural persons and they are human beings, but we also talk about data subjects. So if you can identify a data subject, you can, then it is within scope. If you can't, it's not. Is there any guidance on technical controls needed to adhere to GDPR? The GDPR doesn't actually set out a list of technical controls. I wish it did sometimes, but it tells you the standard that you need to adhere to. And I think I mentioned earlier that within the GDPR we have these words: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Well, those three words, when I read those, jumped out to me and said, well, that's 27001, or an information security standard that we have to implement. Is there any guidance? Yeah, that's the technical controls question. NIS, does this apply to HR advisory companies? The best thing to do is get the directive, and there is some broad guidance in there about the types of sectors, because this is targeted, the NIS directive is targeted at infrastructure, and it covers a number of sectors. So it's energy, transport, banking is in there, financial markets, health sector. So there are, and as I said earlier, these are going to be refined and defined further by each member state. Has the ICO provided a standard format for reporting GDPR breaches? Not that I'm aware, but they are providing high-level guidance on a number of different things. Okay. Here's a question: is there an opinion which standard for cybersecurity to follow, i.e. the company's already 27001, would the new British standard provide any advantage? That's a good question, and I've recently been working on a project that has involved 27001. There is a cloud element to it as well, so that means 27017 and 18. And when the client has asked me to look at the British Standard and see where that fits, well, for me, the British Standard is clearly approaching it from a data protection perspective, whereas 27001, 27017, 18 are looking at it from a security perspective. And the British Standard, actually, one of the first things it says within there is that there may well be overlapping of standards. It talks about 9001 might be as a standard that might overlap. And I think the reality of the world that we live in is we have a number of standards, and some of them do overlap. We don't live in a perfect world there. So, but certainly within my particular project, we are looking at implementing the 10,012 standard for data privacy. The 27,001 is already in the client at the moment, but because they have a number of cloud services that they have themselves and are contracted to, we're looking at 27,017 and 18. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going through these questions. Okay, somebody's asked, do you require to notify with the supervisory authority if you're a processor? I spoke to them about this probably about a month ago now, and this is one of the things that is under discussion. Because up till now it has only been controllers that had to notify with the relevant supervisory authority, certainly in the United Kingdom anyway, and they are giving some thought to whether to drop that requirement for controllers or whether to adopt it for controllers and processors for both sets of organisations. Somebody's asking, I manage the 27,001 in my organisation. Will it be easy for me to understand how to comply with GDPR requirements? I think over time there will be an increased level of guidance and information coming out from the relevant supervisory authorities. So that will make it easier. Or alternatively, you could go on something like the practitioner course and really get to grips with what the real issues are. There are probably 5 or 6 things that you can start to look at immediately. Just looking at some of these questions. How is the supervisory authority determined? Well, all right, okay, now I understand this. Would it be where the collection takes place, where the data is stored, or where the controller and processor are located? Right, there is, if you really get into the regulation, there is like a hierarchy of, although it's not set out as a hierarchy as such, but for controllers, for instance, the number 1 test is where the bulk of the purpose and means is done, the decisions about purpose and means. So that might be where your head office is. Yeah. There is another test where the bulk of the processing is done, or where the bulk of the service is delivered, and this is really getting down into the depths of the regulation, if you like. And so these are the kind of things, but there is a hierarchy, but for controllers it's purpose and means, where the bulk, so most of your decision making is taken in one country. With regard to the service that's being provided, that will be your supervisory authority. If you're a processor and most of your processing takes place in France, that will be the supervisory authority, the default one. Okay. Somebody's asking if we need to take up personal professional indemnity insurance. I wouldn't say so, but you know, I come from a legal background, and my answer to that would be that, you know, this is data protection regulation, so there are fines on the organisation. The UK Information Commissioner has gone on record to say that she would like to hold directors personally liable. Directors, of course, have legal obligations under the Companies Act 2006. So there are a number of things, and those obligations in the 2006 Companies Act apply to directors, managers and employees. Yeah, so everybody has to take that into account. The other thing I'd finally like to say just before we finish is confidentiality within the regulation. The GDPR is quite heavily talked about, and confidentiality of course means different things in different countries, different member states. So just to wrap up, while member states determine fines have to be proportionate, effective and dissuasive. Remember, under the directive, it's down to the member states to define what those fines are. Implementing this is an effective way of the UK government to take this forward and comply with the EU cybersecurity strategy. And in fact, there was a December briefing where the government said they wouldn't regulate around cybersecurity, and that they would concentrate on the implementation or focus on the GDPR. So whilst there's no formal list at the moment, there is some guidance in the directive. Those organisations that operate with the critical national infrastructure, they know who they are, and they need to start preparing for this right now. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. We've had quite a lengthy question session there, so I'm going to end this seminar now, and on behalf of IT Governance, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance. Thank you very much.